Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Khalid. But today is Friday, the 22nd of October 2021, and we'll be discussing the following issues during the course of our show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, with the decision that has been taken by the Financial Action Task Force, otherwise known as the FATF, to continue to put Pakistan on its grey list. This, of course, was a decision that was declared quite recently, and there are a lot of speculations and question marks as to why Pakistan still remains on the grey list. Nevertheless, the FATF chief calls on certain items that have not yet been implemented in letter and spirit by Pakistan, due to which Pakistan remains in the grey list. This is going to be our first segment. Our second story of the day, ladies and gentlemen, concerns, of course, the United Nations and Pakistan. Pakistan has now called on the United Nations Decolonization Committee and the Security Council to take action and end India's colonialization of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir and enable its people to exercise their right to self-determination. Ambassador Munir Akram said, and I quote, "Eradicating colonialism is part of the unfinished agenda of the United Nations." This is going to be our second story of the day. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about Afghanistan and how the United Nations is also moving towards alleviating its current economic and financial woes. Now, the United Nations on Thursday has said it had set up a special trust fund to provide urgently needed cash directly to Afghans through a system that taps into donor funds frozen since the Taliban took over Afghanistan in the month of August. Now, the aim of all of this is to inject liquidity into the Afghan households to permit them to survive the winter, because we know very well that as per a recent survey, around 95% of the households in Afghanistan are only eating once a day so that their children can have the required food as well. So all of this is leading to a very catastrophic situation, due to which different countries, especially Pakistan, have been moving forward and have been talking to all the different fora as far as alleviating this current situation in Afghanistan is concerned. And now the UN has taken action. This is the last story, and no, this is the second last story, in fact, and the last story is about Alec Baldwin, ladies and gentlemen. He was producing and acting in a film on which an unfortunate shooting accident occurred because of Alec Baldwin, and this firearm that was discharged by him, due to which one person has lost his life and another person is in hospital. Now, this leads to a lot of issues concerning the security of those who are present at the set, and how a firearm could be discharged when the shooting of a film was going on. This is going to be our last segment. Let's begin with our first story, ladies and gentlemen. And the first story concerns the Financial Action Task Force that has announced on Thursday that Pakistan is going to remain on its grey list. Now, Pakistan has been on the grey list of the FATF because of, as the FATF says, deficiencies in its counter-terror financing and anti-money laundering regimes since June 2018. Now, Dr. Marcus Blair, who's the chief or the head of the FATF, or the president of the FATF, said that Pakistan had to complete 2 concurrent action plans with a total of 34 items. Now, it has addressed more or less largely 30 of the 34 items. This was said by Marcus Blair. And Pakistan, of course, has been fighting financial terrorism, has been fighting the financial issues as well. We know all the steps that the current government has taken, and there has been a reaction by Hamad Azhar as well, who has deemed this decision by the FATF as positive. He says, and I quote, that Pakistan would complete within 3 to 4 months the only remaining FATF target on speedy prosecution of the United Nations designated terror group leaders. He, of course, was quite optimistic as far as this decision taken by the FATF is concerned. Now, there are 2 points on which the FATF kind of put Pakistan on its grey list. The first was an action taken in 2018. The second was in 2020. An additional set of measures that were announced by a sister organization of the FATF as far as the measures that Pakistan had to comply with in order to come out of the grey list. Dr. Usman Chohan, who's a political economist, joins us online. Dr. Saab, thank you very much to have joined us. Dr. Saab, Pakistan remaining on the grey list, does this decision come as a surprise to you?
As a matter of fact, it doesn't, because as you and I have been talking for many months and many quarters now, it seems to be always the same thing. We make some progress, and we make actually quite a bit of progress, and yet there isn't very much recognition for it. There's always something more you have to do and something more you have to do. And in the end, Pakistan has done a remarkable job in terms of fixing its anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorists, and so on. But it doesn't receive the recognition for all this hard work.
All right, but Dr. Saab, tell me one thing. Why did in 2020 the Asia Pacific Group identify another set of serious issues when Pakistan was complying with all the other issues?
The reason is because money laundering or any of these other aspects of the FATF's evaluation continue to happen on a real-time basis, and you can always have different things in the system that come up. For example, 5 years ago, there was no such thing as cryptocurrencies, and now there is.
True.
And so there's always new things that come up. It's a part of the system. But the thing is it a fair evaluation? I think that's what really matters.
All right, Dr. Saab, I'd like for our viewers, a lot of people don't understand the economic implications or the economic nitty-gritties of it also. I'd like to you to kind of simplify things for me. 4 items on the latest agenda that was given by the Asia Pacific Group have been complied with Pakistan, and I'll name those quote-unquote amendments in the Mutual Legal Assistance Act 2020, AML, CFT, anti-money laundering, combating the financing of terrorism, supervision of designated non-financial businesses and professions. This was the second item that Pakistan has complied with. The third is transparency of beneficial ownership information. The fourth is the implementation of targeted financial sanctions for proliferation finance by these designated non-financial businesses and professions. Pakistan has complied with these 4 as per the FATF, and the FATF says the remaining items in the 2021 action plan include investigations and prosecutions of the money laundering cases, confiscation of assets and UN listings. Now, kindly explain these in simple terms for those who do not understand.
All right. Well, the points that that you listed that we have complied with indicate the exchange of information. They indicate communication between our agencies and external agencies, as well as between our local agencies, and a clarity on who actually owns what in terms of major assets, suspicious assets. So the points that we have worked on successfully are ones that indicate that we have a clearer idea about who owns what of importance. The ones that are left over are a bit more sensitive, and those are, well, if somebody has violated according to the whatever list, for example, the UN's list or other lists, violated whatever provisions they have, well, what do you do about it? Do you prosecute them? Do you show that they have been put into some kind of regime? Do they have to serve certain sentences? That's what's really left over. So in terms of the easier stuff, but still important, it doesn't mean it's easy, but the stuff that's easier to prove, we have done a good job. And the stuff that is always more debatable or requires long-term evaluation, like serving a long sentence, that has yet to be proved satisfactorily.
Now, Dr. Saab, you remember firstly in 2018 when Pakistan was asked to comply with certain regulations put forward by the FATF, those out of those 26 out of the 27 requirements that were put forward by the FATF were complied with. The only one that the FATF says is remaining out of those 27 rather is the financial terrorism. Pakistan has been doing a lot as far as financial terrorism is concerned. Why then is the FATF not satisfied by Pakistan's progress?
Oh, you're absolutely right. 26 out of 27 would be a remarkable score on any test. I take your point. But the other part, the provision is, remaining item was financial terrorism and needing to address the concerns of investigation and prosecution of senior leaders and commanders.
And commanders of the UN designated terror groups.
So that's a specific list of people, and that's as easy or as hard as you want it to be. But that's much more than just the technicalities or the accounting. I'd like to put it that way. There's much more than just accounting involved there.
All right, Dr. Saab. So we have this one item that remains out of the 2018, and out of the last couple of additional provisions that were put forward by the FATF, we apparently have 3 more that need to be complied with. How easy or difficult in your point of view will these 4 be? Because 30 out of 34 is not a bad score, isn't it?
You're right. 30 out of 34 is also a very good score. But the thing is, now it's not so much about the accounting or the technicalities. In terms of sharing information, in terms of producing information, Pakistan is actually an excellent country. Like, we should give ourselves a pat on the back, especially for a country at our level of development, in terms of how much we have streamlined the major parts of our economy relative to the scale, right? I mean, it's not the largest economy in the world, and actually there isn't as much quote hanky panky happening here as there is in India, for example. So given the scope of things, we've done a good job. But the last few things, that's more contentious because that's a specific list of people that they want. They want blood basically, and that's tricky. That involves having all of our stakeholders here recognizing this is worth it or not worth it. That's a very sensitive topic, in fact.
All right. Now, speaking of sensitive topics, you remember about the allegation or a statement by India saying that it was a country that was pressurizing the FATF to keep Pakistan on the grey list, and that had been negated by the FATF, saying that the FATF is a conglomerate of different countries and it's a consensus that is evolved when a decision is taken regarding any other country. How would you put this statement by the FATF and by India? Who is right, who isn't, in your point of view?
I think I think the FATF is being dishonest here, and yet it's factually correct that it is a consensus-based process. But the fact that it makes it seem like all countries equally arrive at an equal, without any power asymmetries at their decisions, is not true. And the fact that Jaishankar was admitting this, Jaishankar Saab is the External Affairs Minister of India. He was talking to his own people. He was talking to a coalition of BJP representatives. It was not meant for
an international audience. But he did say that, quote unquote, this was a statement that he made on record.
He made it on record, and he was addressing his local audience, and he was trying to brag about what they have achieved. And I think he's absolutely right, because there were no stakes involved. He was trying to impress his local audience, and I think it is true that India plays a very dirty game in these things. So I think what Marcus Plyer, the head of the FATF, really did was he sidestepped the question and said, oh, we are very innocent and it's a technical process. And I think that we have to step back from the technical mystique of the FATF. Power asymmetries exist among the countries in it, and it is used as an instrument of financial coercion, and so it's dishonest for the FATF not to confront that. It's good that the question was raised, but his answer to it is unsatisfactory in my judgment.
When you talk of asymmetry, how can Pakistan address this on the level of or the forum of the FATF or other fora, so as to make those fora understand that Pakistan is being unjustly put in a list that it should have come out of long ago?
Well, there's several ways to do this in the longer run. Either you have a contrary or a, let's say, analogous institution that is also looking at AML and CFT issues, and it renders a verdict on the FATF's verdict. That would be a very powerful way to do it. So you have a judge off the judge. Similarly, you could have a committee within the United Nations or a subcommittee that looks at the performance of various international institutions that are not UN bodies, such as the FATF. So there's other forum where the FATF could be brought into light, not with enforcement, but just to have a discussion about whether these things are working. To be honest with you, with the Pandora Papers, with Panama Papers, with all the papers, you see that the world is awash in black money, and Pakistan is a very, very small player in the global scheme of tax havens and all that. And I think that it's important for us and for the world not to lose sight of where money is. Where is this money going? Where are these islands? And do they really need the trillions that they get from actual societies and economies? It doesn't make sense.
All right. I mean, I understand and I maybe agree with a lot of what you're saying, but a lot of things don't make sense. I mean, I totally agree with you on that point. A lot of things don't make sense to us, but they make sense to a lot of other countries. Pakistan, do you feel, is being discriminated against? And if so, I mean, is there any forum? I mean, I've just asked you the same question previously, but is there any good regulatory forum that Pakistan can address or go to talk about this unjustified response by the FATF?
Well, at the moment, the structures of international power and the bodies that are supposed to regulate are not working properly. And what I mean by that is there is no accountability of the accountability. There are no watchmen of the watchmen. And that makes it very hard for us. But that doesn't mean that in the future such institutions or such fora can exist. So what we should be doing is towards promoting the accountability of those holding people, quote, accountable. I don't think the FATF really does a good job of holding people accountable, because the people that end up on the countries that end up on the blacklist or the gray list may not necessarily be the worst offenders, neither in absolute or relative terms. So my answer to you is, at the moment, it's all a bit of a mess in international geopolitics, but that doesn't mean it always has to be like that. And so we can strive towards creating alternate fora or fora that evaluate fora. And you can be imaginative about this, but what you'd require is at least some buy-in from those institutions and nation states that benefit from the status quo. That persuasion isn't easy, but it's worth it.
All right, let's talk about persuasion. I mean, and let's talk about the new countries that have been put on the list. Jordan, Mali, and Turkey have been now put on the grey list, and Botswana and Mauritius have been taken out. And of course, Zimbabwe has completed its action plan, and it will soon also be taken out of that list. Do you feel that the FATF, in your point of view, I'm asking you your point of view, is being used as a tool to A, coerce certain countries to comply with certain preconditions, or B, move away from certain coalitions or friendships or cooperations?
I think that there's two waves that move simultaneously. On one hand, there are technical evaluations happening. For example, Botswana being on there was not a geopolitical thing, for example. That has to do with the technicalities because of the certain industries there and the oversight of those industries. But at the same time, politics comes in there. And it isn't easy for those who try to be neutral in world affairs to disaggregate what is neutral from what is partial. And that's the problem. So FATF does do good work on certain things. For example, on virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies. FATF does good work in certain other domains, but at the same time, it isn't solving the global problem of money laundering or even countering the financing of terrorism. So actually, the FATF's mandate is so big, and given its legitimacy is questionable, like it's not a UN treaty body, for example, it's a voluntary consensus body, interministerial body, so it does punch above its weight in suspicious manners. And I think just creating that public awareness in Pakistan is very important, that this isn't a treaty body. I mean, you shouldn't be giving it that sort of importance in world affairs because it doesn't draw upon that legitimacy.
All right, but if it doesn't draw on that legitimacy, why does the world body, the big world bodies or the countries that matter rely on the FATF's decision to strengthen their cooperation with the countries that are on different lists?
Well, one reason is that the main reason is that countries are always relying on as many tools of coercion as possible. This happens to be one of them, but you find a lot of coercion in all domains. And the other thing is that the actual treaty organizations, for example, the World Bank, IMF, etc., they extend legitimacy to the FATF. For example, for us to comply with the extended fund facility of the IMF, it was made into a semi-condition, if not a full condition, that we have to be compliant with the FATF's requirements. So the IMF, which is the legitimate body, confers this on the FATF. That's where it all gets very blurred, because IMF is a serious, proper institution, but yet the FATF gets mulled in or gravitates towards the same aura of legitimacy, which isn't fair.
All right, Dr. Saab, also countries that are not on any list but are involved in financial terrorism, countries like India, we've heard so many stories. The uranium is one of the stories, but there are so many others that are going on. Despite that, why isn't a country like India put on any list by the FATF? Again, is this certain, how should I say, favorism that is being put on India by certain countries that are essential parts of the FATF, or is there something else that is in the works?
You're absolutely right. Actually, India violates just about everything that the FATF cares about. Proliferation is an important newer area of the FATF, like actual nuclear proliferation stuff. It violates it. Similarly, money laundering, in the pure sense of moving money in and out in the black economy, they do that, all at huge amounts. Similarly, the terrorism thing, all the dossiers point to this all the time. But finally, cryptocurrencies and virtual currencies, the Everything is being violated by India all the time. But the question is, why is this allowed to go? And I think the power asymmetries we alluded to, they matter. Not so much in FATF central body, although it is there, but specifically the mirror body of the Asia Pacific group. That is very much
That has really
boxing
emerged
ring.
as the one of the main players in the FATF of recently.
Correct. It's a boxing ring that's the mirror body. So whatever the APG recommends as a parallel list, like you keep saying, for example, out of 34 points, and yet sometimes we say out of 27 points. These are both correct. One list is APG,
Exactly.
one is FATF, and so people get confused. What are we aiming for? So APG has a disproportionate. India has a disproportionate influence over the APG, which then echoes on to the FATF. So these types of relationships between bodies is very hard to follow, but they all matter.
All right, now Marcus Player as well as other officials at the FATF say that Pakistan has really worked hard in order to comply with all the preconditions put forward by the FATF. Despite that, Pakistan is still on the grey list. And in February next year, they're going to decide again in another meeting whether Pakistan continues in the grey list or not. My next question has two parts. A, do you still feel that Pakistan will remain on the grey list after February 2022? And B, what does Pakistan need to do now that it has complied with almost all of the preconditions laid down by the Asia Pacific Group as well as the FATF?
It's hard to say because the situation in our local environment has changed so much. So, for example, in the previous plenary, there was a different government in Kabul. There was a different environment in South Asia. So, how will the environment play out in February 2022? Where will Afghanistan be? Which government? Which people? How many people will be starving? How much of the Afghan reserves held abroad will be allowed to be accessed? These are all very, very big questions, and they do impact on us because global geopolitics right now are undergoing a huge transformation. Afghanistan is one facet which particularly impacts us, and it's hard to say, even 6 months out, how that will influence the minds of those bodies and institutions that have to relay verdicts on countries in the region. It's very hard to say, to be honest. I would hesitate.
All right. All right. So Afghanistan, you feel, is going to be a very important player as far as Pakistan's inclusion or not in the grey list is concerned next year when the meeting is going to be held. Apart from Afghanistan, what are the other issues that need to be handled properly by Pakistan in order to come out of the grey list? That is, unless and until they don't add more preconditions to the existing preconditions that they have put forward to Pakistan.
They could always add more conditions and
Of
say it's
course, they have.
mutually
They did. The
evaluation.
Asia Pacific Group did add the other preconditions, didn't it? The 7 others.
Absolutely. Well, one thing is consistency. So these mutual evaluations are evaluated over a long period of time. So keeping that consistency in our progress, we should be very proud. Like, look at the technical stuff. We should be very proud of how we've, in such a short time, made Pakistan's financial oversight architecture so much.
All right, we were talking to Dr. Usman Chohan, political economist, and we were talking in detail about the different provisions of the FATF. And of course, we are going back to Dr. Chohan. He's back online now. Dr. Saab, you were saying?
Yes, I'd like to continue to lay the emphasis on the successes of Pakistan. The points that we have achieved are a very big deal. We should be very proud in terms of fixing the technical environment of financial oversight. What is left is quite political, it's also quite sensitive, and decisions have to be taken at all levels, including at the mid and lower levels, about how these things are going to be enforced. It's not easy for any one person to answer, but we should always keep in mind that a strong, robust, dynamic economic oversight architecture is in Pakistan's interest. We have to be very proud of the achievements made by our country in a very short time.
And we need to be extremely proud of all that Pakistan has done, and also what it has achieved as far as the preconditions laid down by the FATF is concerned in a very short span of time. This is also what Hamad Azhar Saab, the Minister for Industries, has said in a tweet after the decision that was taken by the FATF. Thank you very much, Dr. Usman Chohan, to have joined us, to have talked to us about the latest decision of the FATF to keep Pakistan in the grey list. It is in February 2022 that they are going to decide whether Pakistan still remains in the grey list or comes out of it. Well, only time will tell what is going to happen in the next few months. But as per Dr. Usman Chohan, there are a lot of probabilities that could go one way or the other. Let's go to our second segment, ladies and gentlemen. That concerns India and Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan has called on the United Nations Decolonization Committee and the Security Council to take action and end India's colonization of Indian Jammu and Kashmir. More in the following report.
The saffron Indian regime, backed by extremist RSS and a staunch Hindutva approach, persists in perpetrating gross human rights violations in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The outrageous brutality against innocent Kashmiri civilians is part of imperial Indian designs to stimulate demographic change in the Muslim-majority valley. In order to implement its settler colonial agenda, Indian government imposed most brutal military and digital siege upon beleaguered valley to crush popular resistance with brute force. Pakistan exhibits its enduring commitment to Kashmir cause as it highlighted the brutal repression of Kashmiris at all international forums. Ambassador Munir Akram, in a speech to the General Assembly's Special Political and Decolonization Committee, emphasized that eradicating colonialism is part of unfinished agenda of the United Nations, and thus Security Council must take action to end India's colonization of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Indian occupation is worst manifestation of modern day colonialism, but no amount of brutal oppression and atrocities have dented resolve of Kashmiris. Despite 7 decades of occupation and the denial of their right to self-determination, the Kashmiris continue their steadfast demand for the right to choose their future. Pakistan and its people have always stood for a peaceful resolution of the Kashmir dispute according to aspirations of the people of Kashmir and in keeping with the principles of United Nations Security Council resolutions.
Now, of course, we'll be joined by our guest very shortly. But until then, let's talk a little bit about what was said in this meeting. Pakistan called on the United Nations Decolonization Committee and the Security Council to end India's colonization of Jammu and Kashmir to enable its people to exercise their right to self-determination. Yasir Abbas, international law expert, joins us online. Yasir, thank you very much to have joined us. Yasir, how do you see Pakistan's pledge in the United Nations to end India's colonization of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir? A, and B, how much action do you feel will the United Nations take on this pledge by Pakistan?
Thank you, Omar. So Pakistan has been, from last couple of years, has been at the forefront in vigorously advocating for the rights of the people of Kashmir. And the latest proceedings at the Special Political and Decolonization, basically what is called the Fourth Committee, it has upped basically its efforts to expose the colonial designs of India, the parallels of which we had only seen back in the days of the European empires, the Dutch empires, the Belgian empires, and also the British empires. And the way the people of Kashmir have been treated through the blockade of internet, through the mobile phones and the landlines and television, it all is basically a manifestation of what used to happen back in the colonial days. So with regards to the United Nations, I think that as much as we should continue vigorously engaging the India in all the global forums, we have to understand that the whole concept of decolonization from last couple of decades has lost its meaning within the international community, especially in the United Nations. We have seen that the principle of non-interference in international law, it has been widely acknowledged by the international community. And then there is this concept of principle of territorial integrity, which we see has been a cornerstone of international law. And then the whole idea behind this concept of accession or succession is kind of looked down upon within the United Nations. So we need to work around these areas in order to first convince the international community that talking about Kashmir or discussing the Kashmir in the United Nations is not against the principle of non-interference. Rather, it's an effort to decolonize a region. And then by basically advocating for the rights of Kashmiris, the international community is not by any means questioning the territorial integrity of India, rather holding it accountable for keeping a region under its colonial control. And then we need to convince the international community that what's happening in Kashmir is not a succession movement. It's an effort to basically get the rightful independence from the state of India by the people
All
of
right,
Kashmir.
Yasir, let me kind of take you back to the month of August, rather 5th of August 2021, when in the very auspices of the United Nations, Stefan Dujarric clearly said that that the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is a disputed area, because you remember what Mr. Trimurti, the Indian ambassador to the United Nations, had said, that the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India, and so it is an internal matter. And to that there was a rejoinder by Stefan Dujarric that explained very clearly as to what the United Nations stance on Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir was exactly. But that was August. Today we are almost at the end of October. Nothing still has happened, has it?
You're right, Omar. There hasn't been any substantial change of perception in the United Nations with regards to the issue of Kashmir. But we have to understand that how the United Nations operate basically when it's about the issue of right to self-determination or decolonization. We have seen that the United Nations has been consistently reluctant to recognize, the right to self-determination across the world. It's not just about the Kashmir. We have seen that in the case of Morocco. We have seen in the case of even Palestine as well. So in principle, the United Nations has adopted a practice of basically respecting this whole idea of, this whole principle of territorial sovereignty. So there is this largely a fear within the United Nations that if the United Nations will have a clear policy on the right to self-determination, then there will be several fault lines which might result into clashes across the world. So the whole norm of state sovereignty, when it concerns the territorial
frightens certain
integrity.
countries. This is what you're trying to say. The whole action, if for example, the United Nations imposes its rule as far as Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is concerned, it will create a lot of tensions in other countries, because they might think that their next target could be those as well. Is that what you're trying to say?
I think that United Nations basically is cognizant of the fact that there will be a domino effect if the whole idea of right to self-determination is given the kind of attention that it was given right after the World War II. So there is a fear, yes, within the international community as well, because that would mean that you will question a lot of state control on several areas. The question of Spain would emerge, the question of Western Sahara would emerge, and the question of Palestine will gain momentum as well. So the whole idea, the whole perception behind self-determination in the United Nations has been treated in a way that there is a maximum restraint in acknowledging a struggle that is deeply rooted into right to self-determination. And there is a lot of power politics involved in it, and many countries, many nations in the world, they don't want the same level of attention that the right to self-determination used to get right after the World War II. So there is this lack of consensus, this lack of acknowledgement on the part of international community and United Nations in general.
All right, but Yasir, then where does that leave Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, despite all the pledges, despite all the resolutions in the United Nations, despite all the reports by the UNHRC, despite all the efforts and actions taken by Pakistan? This issue will remain unresolved because it will lead to, as you said, a domino effect. What should Pakistan do then in this case?
I think we need to argue the case of Kashmir in a more coherent way, in a more legal way in front of the international community. As I said earlier, that there are several there are few basically principles which limit the whole issue of Indian occupied Kashmir to be discussed, the magnitude of the issue rather. So that Pakistan should basically focus on driving a difference between what other nations, what other regions are going through and what's happening in Kashmir. Kashmir stands out as one of the regions which is deeply militarized. We have almost 8
900,000
lakh
plus troops there.
900 exactly troops over there. And then if a region, if you require a 9 lakh 90,000 troops in a region to basically have it under your control, that means that it's not a territory which is a part of the state. Rather, it's a region which is forcefully occupied, forcefully colonized. And India, with its actions in August by abolishing the Article 35A and 370, has in fact, drifted from its own position where it had acknowledged the region to be disputed, acknowledged the dispute to be a right to self-determination. So after 35A, now the non-Kashmiris are allowed to invest in the Kashmir in the name of development. They are also allowed to buy lands and property. So the whole focus, the whole efforts of Indian state in the Kashmir is partly what used to happen in the colonial times as well, in the name of development, in the name of terrorism as well. So India has been propagating or has been practicing the same practices which the previous colonial empires used to do. So it's pretty much up to the international community that this issue needs to be looked at from a different prism, rather than this is not an isolated example, or this is not one of the several examples of right to self-determination, but it's unique by virtue of the number of troops over there, by virtue of the level of atrocities being carried out by the state, and also by virtue of the by virtue of basically the sanctions that the state of India has imposed on the Kashmiri masses.
All right, Yasir, my final question to you. Now, in August also, when the whole issue was clarified by Stefan Dujarric, it was again rebutted by India. Now also, when Munir Akram Saab talked about decolonization of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, that was again rebutted by the Indian delegate, saying that the region is an integral part of their country, quote unquote. Now, I'll go back to a small rejoinder that was given by Munir Akram Saab way back in August after what Stefan Dujarric had said, and he talked about 4 important points. Let me just narrate them to you. Jammu and Kashmir is a United Nations recognized disputed territory and not an integral part of India. Second, Security Council resolutions calling for a plebiscite remain in force and can be abrogated only by the Security Council itself. Third, India's unilateral and illegal actions on the 5th of August 2019 violate the Security Council resolutions number 91 and 122 and are thus null and void. And fourth, a dialogue between India and Pakistan will be productive once India reverses the unilateral and illegal measures imposed on and after the 5th of August 2019, and B, rescinds the demographic changes initiated in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir region and halts its oppression and the human rights violations. These are 4 very important points that have remained true before Munir Akram Saab talked about them, and even now. Will India reciprocate on any one of these points, let alone talk to Pakistan?
I don't think so, because for that we have to understand the BJP manifesto. It has been anti-minority, basically, with regards to the Muslims, with regards to the Dalits, with regards to basically all the minorities in India. And I don't see it changing, very soon. However, I would argue that the mantra of counter-terrorism is the single point agenda on which India is cashing on in international community. What they're trying to do is they're trying to narrow down the whole issue of right to self-determination and colonial efforts to terrorism. They think that it's because of the single issue of Pakistan's alleged support for, groups inside Kashmir. That's the principal problem. We have to counter that. We have to basically convince the international community that it's not the language of terrorism that is the problem in Kashmir. It's the state of India and its designs, and more specifically the designs of the BJP. We have seen, because all the previous governments in India, starting from Nehru, they all have agreed on the fact that Kashmir indeed is a disputed territory, and that India and Pakistan will sit to basically resolve this issue. However, after Modi came into the government, the whole approach towards this issue has shifted, and now India considers it a forcefully an integral part of India, which is a negation of the 70-year stand that the successive governments in India took. So, I don't see any significant changes that the BJP government will take.
That will occur on this issue between India and Pakistan, because of course, the Indian attitude that it consists of completely changing the narrative of the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir region, saying that it is an integral part of India, when it was India itself that had gone to the United Nations in 1948 to find a resolution to this issue. Thank you very much, Yasir, to have joined us and to have talked to us about this latest pledge that Pakistan took at the United Nations to decolonize the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir region, something that of course was rebutted by India. But of course, Pakistan will continue its efforts on all the different fronts to make the world realize what India is doing in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir region is unjust, is brutal. Let's go to our last two stories, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, the first concerns Afghanistan. The United Nations has set up a trust fund for people's economy in Afghanistan. Now, on Thursday, the UN has said that it is going to be set up this special fund to urgently give cash to the Afghans that need it, because winter is upon us. As you know, we are at the end of October. Even in Pakistan, the winter season is slowly and steadily coming. It's raining as we speak. Now, a lot of assets have been frozen by the US. Washington also lately said that the Afghan assets will remain frozen. Also, the IMF and the World Bank continue to freeze the Afghan assets, which leads to economic woes in Afghanistan. And of course, a bad economy means that people do not get enough to eat. And a lot of households, the majority of households in Afghanistan as we speak, are without food. So Germany is the first contributor to this fund. It has pledged 50 million euros to the fund, and the UN said it is in touch with other donors as well to help it out, so that the money can directly reach the Afghans through NGOs. And our last story, ladies and gentlemen, is about American actor Alec Baldwin, who accidentally or not, but this is something that we'll know in due time, fired a shot on a movie set that killed a woman. Now, Helena Hutchins, director of photography, and director Joel Souza, both were shot upon by Alec Baldwin. Alec Baldwin is a very renowned actor and a comedian and a director as well, and a producer as well. Now, Helena Hutchins, who's 42 years of age, lost her life, was pronounced dead by medical personnel, while as Joel D'Souza, who's the director, was taken in an ambulance, as of course he's being treated as we speak. Now, this leads to a lot of questions as to the security of the staff in on movie sets in Hollywood is concerned. If we go in the past, in 1993, Brandon Lee, who was the son of Bruce Lee, at that time Brandon Lee was 28. He passed away after being hit by a .44 caliber slug while filming a death scene. Also in 1984, another actor died after shooting himself in the head with a prop gun blank. Now, these are incidents that need to be avoided at the maximum. There are so many different communities that are present within Hollywood that work for the rights of the people. It is high time that Hollywood also took on this very important issue, that is the accidental shootings on sets, and making sure and ensure that such props are not used on the movie sets. It could happen anytime. It could happen in Hollywood. It could also happen in another country. So we need to be extremely careful with that. With that, we come to an end of today's newsroom. It is the end of the week. It's raining. So of course, be very careful. But at the same time, you know, with water comes the dengue, because the mosquitoes swirl around it. So be very vigilant as far as dengue is concerned as well. And when we come to the pandemic. I hope you've all had your 2 jabs taken. If not, go to the nearest place, clinic or hospital, and get yourself vaccinated and continue following the SOPs. We wish you a great weekend, and we'll see you inshallah on Monday. Allah Hafiz.